If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I was 24 the summer I decided to visit my cousin Ray in the Monongahela backcountry of West Virginia. I just finished a year working at a gas station outside Pittsburgh, saving up for grad school, and I thought a couple weeks in the mountains would clear my head before I buried myself in books again. Ray wasn't exactly the family's shining star. He lived in a sagging house left behind by an old lumber company, the kind of place you'd expect to collapse under the weight of its own roof. The boards had gone gray with rain and time, and someone had tacked mismatched sheets of tin over the windows where glass should have been. A porch hung crookedly over a patch of dirt that used to be a yard, and the wood beneath your feet moaned like it was in pain every time you stepped on it. Ray was older than me by 10 years, but he acted like a man who'd long ago stopped caring whether days passed or not. He drank coffee from cracked mugs at 2 in the morning, chain-smoked until the air inside looked like a fog bank, and slept whenever his body forced him to. His only rules for me were simple. Don't mess with his tools, don't eat the last of his jerky, and don't ask too many questions after dark. It was that last rule that hooked me. He'd say it half jokingly, half like he meant it. Whenever I pressed him, he'd grunt and wave me off. But one night, after a few beers, he leaned back in his chair and told me about a place he called the Devil's Split. I'd never heard of it, and I knew the area pretty well from childhood road trips. It wasn't on the maps at the ranger station or mentioned in the hiker's guides. Ray said people avoided talking about it, that even the old-timers in the next town over would clam up if you brought it up. Supposedly, it was a crack in the limestone ridge about 3 miles from his place, a wound in the mountain so narrow you had to turn sideways to slip inside. He said his granddad had gone once as a teenager, and came back raving about voices in the rock, voices that didn't echo but answered. Ray himself claimed he'd gone too years back, dared by some friends, but he wouldn't say what he saw. He just shook his head and muttered, "Mountain keeps what it wants." Naturally, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Curiosity gnawed at me until I started bringing it up every day. Ray pretended to ignore me, but after a week of my pestering, he finally gave in. One gray morning, while we were eating cold cereal out of chipped bowls, he slammed his spoon down and said, "Fine, we'll go. But if my dog don't step foot near it, neither will we." The dog was an old black mutt named Gus. He looked half dead most days, fur falling out in patches, ribs showing clear under his hide. But he had this growl that could rattle your chest if he wanted to. Ray trusted that dog more than he trusted people. We set out just after noon, carrying a couple flashlights, a jug of water, and nothing else. The trail wasn't really a trail at all, just a line of trampled grass that twisted between stands of oak and rhododendron. As we walked deeper into the forest, the air grew heavy, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. No birds called, no wind moved the branches. Even our footsteps seemed too loud, crunching against the damp earth. Halfway up the ridge, Gus stopped dead. His body stiffened, and his hackles rose straight as nails. At first, he didn't make a sound, just stared at a patch of shadow between 2 rocks. Then he crouched low and let out this growl that seemed to come from the ground itself. I'd never heard anything like it. His eyes glinted wet and wild, and without warning, he spun around and bolted back the way we came, tail tucked tight. Ray swore under his breath. "That ain't good," he muttered, but he kept walking. I hesitated, torn between chasing after the dog and following him. Curiosity won. When we reached the split, I saw why people gave it such a name. It wasn't just a cave, it was a gash, a jagged scar in the stone wall that looked like the mountain had been pulled apart by some great hand. Cool air poured out of it, damp and steady, carrying a smell like rust and old earth. I had to tilt sideways to squeeze inside, my shoulders scraping the stone, my breath quickening as the daylight behind us shrank to a ribbon. Inside, the temperature dropped at once. My ears felt clogged, like we'd descended too quickly in an airplane, and the air clung wet against my skin. Our flashlights cut narrow beams through the dark, bouncing off slick, uneven walls. My own breath came back to me, not as echoes, but as whispers, too quick, too sharp. We pressed deeper and the walls began to show marks. Not carvings exactly, but long gouges, as though something with nails or claws had scraped in panic against the rock. They overlapped, spiraled, crossed one another, and some went so deep my fingers fit inside them. My stomach turned when I realized some were fresh. We reached a fork. One passage sloped upward, faintly brighter. The other curved downward into blackness. Ray pointed to the left. "That'll take you out eventually. Right's nothing but trouble." Of course, I wanted to see trouble. I told him I'd only peek. He shook his head but didn't stop me. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing me to crawl on hands and knees. My flashlight jittered against the walls as I pushed forward. The air smelled worse here, metallic and foul, and the stone pressed close enough to scrape my shoulders raw. I counted my movements just to keep from panicking. 10 pushes, 15, 20, until suddenly the rock opened into a chamber. It was low and round, like a bubble carved in the stone. My relief at standing faded when I realized Ray wasn't behind me. His flashlight, his voice, nothing. The silence pressed so thick it hurt my ears. I called his name, but the sound that came back was wrong. Not delayed like a normal echo, but immediate, sharp and twisted, like someone else had shouted it back from inside my own skull. I spun, sweeping my light around. That's when I noticed the hole. It wasn't the one I came through. This was smaller, nearly hidden behind a bulge in the stone. A thin draft sighed from it, carrying a faint sour stench. I stepped closer and froze. The sound started as a scrape, something dragging metal over stone, steady and deliberate. Then it shifted, became more like teeth-sucking air through gaps. My light wavered toward the hole, and in that beam I caught a glimpse of something crouched inside. At first I thought it was a person. Shoulders hunched, limbs folded unnaturally tight. But the skin, it didn't look alive. It was ashen, brittle, like newspaper left in the rain until the ink bled away. Its head tilted at an angle too precise, like it was adjusting to the light. And in one hand, impossibly delicate, it held something red. Not a lollipop this time. A ribbon. Faded crimson, tied in a bow, dangling limp from its fingers. My stomach turned cold. My sister used to wear a ribbon like that in her hair when she was little. I hadn't thought of it in years. The sight of it here in the hands of something not human made my knees lock. Then it moved. Not lunging, not crawling, just uncoiling as though the stone had been storing it all along. Its torso twisted first, then the head, and when its face came into view, it wore a smile. Not playful, not cruel, just private, like someone remembering an old joke no one else could hear. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall so hard my flashlight flickered. The scraping grew louder, closer, though the thing itself didn't advance. It only smiled, tilting its head as if listening through the rock itself. "Move," a voice barked behind me. "Ray." His light blasted across the chamber. I turned, relief flooding me, and when I looked back, the hole was empty. No figure, no ribbon, only stone and silence. We didn't speak as we crawled out. My arms bled from scrapes. My palms were raw, and I gasped like I'd run a marathon when we finally spilled back into the daylight. Ray's face was pale under the grime. He admitted he hadn't followed me inside. Gus had come back to the house barking like mad, and something in the sound had driven him up the ridge. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the spare room. I stayed on the couch with every light burning, listening to Gus pacing outside like he couldn't decide whether to howl or run. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. When I woke, the front door was unlocked. I know Ray bolted it. I remember the click, but it hung open, drifting against the frame. On the step outside lay a strip of red cloth tied in a bow. I wasn't supposed to be in the mountains at all that summer. I had a desk job lined up in Charleston, but a paperwork delay left me with a month and no income. So when my old college acquaintance Jonah called about a little expedition, I said yes before he'd even explained. He and I had been minor legends back on campus for sneaking into off-limits places. Bell towers, sealed tunnels, an abandoned brewery once. Nothing life or death, just that juvenile urge to be where we weren't allowed. Now we were both older, but Jonah had never lost the glint in his eye. "There's a lost tunnel in the Blackwater Gorge," he said on the phone. "A collapsed coal bore that connects to a cavern system no one's mapped. It's not on any GPS, you and me. Bring light gear." The Blackwater area isn't exactly wilderness tourism country. Old logging tracks, washed-out roads, and ridges that rise and twist like sleeping beasts. We left my truck near a derelict sawmill where moss had swallowed the sign, and glassless windows gaped like sockets. From there, we hiked into brush so dense it looked like green smoke. Rusting fence posts marked an old property line, and half-buried farm machinery glinted under vines like skeletons in a bog. The farther we went, the quieter it got. Jonah walked ahead of me with his ridiculous oversized pack. I asked again why he thought this was a good idea. He grinned without turning. "The state's been sealing shafts for decades. This one was marked unstable and forgotten. If it links to a cavern, we'll be the first ones in 50 years. Imagine the footage. It took almost 3 hours to find it. Not an inviting cave mouth. More like a crack where 2 slabs of sandstone had been pried apart. It was vertical, jagged, hidden behind mountain laurel. From 5 feet away, you wouldn't notice it at all. Up close, it looked barely wide enough for one person to slide through sideways." Jonah's face lit up. "Told you," he said, tugging a coil of rope from his pack like a magician producing a scarf. I felt my stomach drop. A rattler or a bear appearing then would have been a blessing, but instead I clipped in and went first. The shaft plunged 20 feet straight and tight. At the bottom, it dog-legged into a crawl space no higher than my chest. The stone was damp and close enough to press on my ribs. I had to inch forward on my elbows, my knees dragging behind. Every movement scraped. The walls were oddly smooth, like water hadn't just eroded them, but something had rubbed them deliberately. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I've never liked small spaces. Jonah knew that. After what felt like forever, the crawl opened abruptly. I hauled myself into a chamber and stood back cracking. My breath fogged. The air was colder than it should have been. Our headlamps threw pale beams across an arched room maybe 30 feet high. Stalactites? None. Flowstone? None, just bare stone with a weird sheen. But the center of the chamber held something that didn't belong at all. A column of pale rock, rising 12 feet from the floor. Perfectly vertical, perfectly smooth, like a giant had pushed a finger up through the earth. It didn't glisten like limestone. It swallowed the light, leaving a soft halo around itself. Jonah crawled out behind me, saw it, and actually whispered, "Jesus." Then, "That's not part of the cave." He stepped closer. I grabbed his arm. "Don't." He shot me a look, but stopped. We stood there, breathing hard, waiting for it to do something. It didn't. Eventually, we backed out, crawled to daylight, and made camp on a flat patch of moss 30 yards downslope. We barely spoke over the little stove. The woods felt dead. No crickets, no night birds, not even a breeze to stir the trees. Sometime after 2 a.m., Jonah shook me awake. His skin looked clammy in the dim light. "You went back in," he said. "What?" I woke up. "You were gone. I heard you laughing down there. I called your name. You didn't answer." I sat up. "Jonah, I've been right here." He stared at me. "Then who—" His words trailed off. He was shivering, though the night wasn't cold. I told him he'd dreamed it. He didn't argue, but he didn't lie back down either. We returned at dawn. This time he went first. I followed, dropping into the main chamber, and stopped. The column was gone. In its place, perfectly centered, was a hole, a circle maybe 6 feet across, edges smooth as polished marble. No debris, no sign of collapse, just a dark throat disappearing straight down. "Was this here yesterday?" I asked. Jonah's voice was tight. "No, we didn't miss it. We couldn't have." He clipped the rope anyway. "We go see." I wanted to protest, but my mouth was dry. We dropped in. I counted seconds aloud, 20, 30, before my boots hit bottom. The chamber below was narrower and darker. The walls felt slick as if oiled. A metallic smell clung to the air, coppery and wet. We moved slowly, our boots making almost no sound, not even an echo. 10 steps in, we found the markings. Dozens of them. Gouges, slashes, arcs. Nothing like letters, but arranged in patterns that hurt your eyes if you tried to follow them. Under our beams, they shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt. I leaned closer and touched one. It was smooth, not chipped. Melted. Jonah began taking photos. That's when we heard it, footsteps above. Slow, dragging. He cupped his hands and shouted up, no reply. Then a second later, the sound came back. His own words, same pitch, same inflection, but off. Like a recording slowed by a fraction. I looked up. At the rim of the shaft, a shape leaned out. Not a person. A face without a face, pale, smooth. 2 pits where eyes might be. It blinked. I snapped off my headlamp. Jonah did the same. We backed into a corner, hearts hammering. My hand brushed something on the ground. Cold, metallic. Train ticket punched decades ago, edges crumbling. How had it gotten down here? The thing descended. No rope, no holds. Just a fluid slide, limbs bending too far the wrong way. It didn't look around. It didn't need to. It stopped in the center of the chamber and crouched, spine arched like a bow. Then it began mimicking our breathing, the scuff of our boots, and finally Jonah's laugh, the one he swore he'd heard in the night. It stretched the sound, distorted it, then spoke a single word, my name. Jonah whispered, "Run." We didn't run so much as crawl, wild and blind, into a fissure barely big enough for our shoulders. Stone shredded my jacket and skin. Behind us, the thing tilted its head, listening. It didn't follow, just stayed at the entrance, repeating my name like it was trying to taste it. We waited, pressed into the dark until my legs cramped and I couldn't tell if an hour had passed or 3. Finally, we decided to bolt. We reached the shaft. The rope was gone. Not unhooked, gone. No anchor, no coil, nothing. I almost vomited. Jonah looked ready to faint. Then with shaking hands, he pulled a spare coil from his pack. He'd brought an emergency rope without telling me. I could have kissed him. We anchored and climbed like demons. When we hauled ourselves out onto the mossy slope, daylight felt like a slap. We didn't stop moving until we reached the truck. Only then, bent over and gasping, did I ask, "What did it say?" He shook his head. "I don't know." A pause. There was another rope. Same brand as mine, new on the far wall. Like somebody else climbed down first. I stared at him, and it was moving, he said quietly. We drove without speaking, gravel spitting from the tires. 2 nights later, back in Charleston, I woke to a sound outside my apartment window. Not footsteps exactly, more like someone breathing in my cadence. When I opened the blinds, no one was there, but a length of rope lay coiled on the sill, knotted exactly the way Jonah had shown. I was 27 when I let myself get dragged into the Laurel Highlands. At that point, I was working dead shifts at a logistics warehouse in Morgantown and wasting the rest of my time posting trip reports from easy caves on regional forums. I wasn't a real spelunker, more like a tag-along with decent stamina and cheap gear. I wrote long-winded posts mostly to prove to myself I wasn't just fading into routine. That's how I crossed paths with a guy named Clay. Clay messaged me after I'd uploaded some blurry photos from a sandstone crawl space near Cooper's Rock. He didn't bother with introductions. His first line was, "You ever heard of Carter's Trace?" I hadn't. He said it was a limestone cut hidden in Mon County's southern hills. Land his family had owned before the mining leases carved the ridge into private parcels. The locals, he wrote, wouldn't go near it. Old mountain warning, he typed. They say if you keep walking the trace long enough, it folds back on itself. Nobody gets past the third bend. Most of the time, when strangers online promised secret caves, it was just sinkholes or storm drains with graffiti. But Clay's messages were clipped, practical. He mentioned having barometric readings from a short descent he'd tried years ago. He didn't brag. That made me pay attention. He said he'd never gone further than the second chamber. And the fact he admitted that, without trying to look heroic, sold me more than anything. We met 2 weekends later, late morning, at a gravel pull-off near a shuttered church south of Fairchance. Clay was already there, leaning against a battered pickup, sorting gear with a kind of calm I envied. He was younger than I'd guessed, maybe 30, buzz cut, work boots. clothes worn soft with use. He gave me a nod, but no handshake. "It's a ways," he said, already striding toward the tree line. The trail wasn't really a trail, more a faint depression weaving between thickets. You could tell it had been something once, maybe cart tracks or a livestock path, but years had blurred it into a memory. The air felt heavier as we climbed, and I realized at some point I hadn't heard a bird since we left the trucks. Even the insects seemed absent. The cave mouth was wedged behind a limestone shelf, roots dangling down like black strings. From the outside, it was less a cave and more a wound in the ridge. Clay tied a rope around a leaning hemlock and fed it into the darkness. "Short drop," he said, then swung down without hesitation. I checked my watch, 12:42 p.m., and followed. The rope burned against my gloves, and then my boots struck rock with a muffled thud. The air hit me immediately. Dry, still, with a mineral tang like dust ground to powder. The walls around us weren't slick like most Appalachian caves. They were brittle, sharp, almost skeletal. My lamp beam showed cracks and planes, as though we were standing inside the ribcage of something petrified. Clay didn't pause. He clipped the rope to a piton, flicked his backup light on, and moved deeper. I marked the wall with chalk out of habit, noting direction and time. He didn't. The first chamber came quick, 10 minutes in maybe. Dome-shaped, unnaturally symmetrical. Maybe 12 feet high at its crown. I tried calling out, testing acoustics. My voice just fell flat, absorbed into the air like I'd whispered into a pillow. Clay tilted his head as if listening to something else entirely. "Feels bigger than it looks," he muttered. I rubbed my jaw, wondering if the pressure was messing with my ears. We pressed into a side tunnel, crawling in places where the ceiling forced us low. After 10 minutes, the stone widened again, barely enough to crouch. Clay's lamp caught something jammed in a crevice. A satchel, canvas, faded olive. He tugged it free and laid the contents out on the floor. There were clothes stiff with old sweat, a rusted folding knife, a busted lamp, a cracked plastic bottle that smelled foul, and a notebook swollen with damp. Most of the pages were fused, but Clay flipped carefully until he found a section still legible. 3 lines remained in shaky graphite, still deeper. Thought I turned around. "Keep ending up here. Can't tell if down or sideways anymore." Not alone, that last line landed like a stone in my gut. Clay read it 3 times, face unreadable. Then his headlamp flickered. He tapped the casing. Nothing, darkness. "I've got another," he said softly, unclipping his spare. I swung my beam toward him, and in that glow, shadows stretched wrong. Too tall, bent like they clung to angles the cave didn't have. He swapped the battery, light flaring back, and froze. Fresh scratches scarred the wall behind him. Long vertical gouges grouped in uneven pairs. We hadn't seen them before. They were clean, recent. Neither of us spoke. We backed out, instinct, no plan. Just the crawl of 2 people suddenly aware they were intruding. But minutes later, something shifted. The rock texture changed. Our chalk marks were gone. Not smudged, not worn off. Gone like we'd never touched the walls. The tunnel forked again, though I swore there hadn't been a fork earlier. We chose left because left felt less wrong. My thighs ached. My pulse was ragged. My watch said we'd only been inside 90 minutes, but my body screamed days. That's when we found the boot. Just one. Mud-caked, torn, toe split open like wet paper. No foot inside. A little further on, my lamp picked up a headlamp identical to mine, still blinking faintly. "Low battery. You think someone else—" I began. "Quiet," Clay said. He was staring at the walls again. New scratches climbed higher now, arranged in precise lines, almost deliberate. Not frantic, ordered. We should have turned back, but something pulled us on. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe the same mania that drives people to stare at a cliff and then step off anyway. Then came the light. It wasn't from us. Ahead, the stone itself glowed faint amber, like fire through gauze. No flame, no lanterns, just a slow pulse radiating from the rock veins. Clay stepped forward like he was hypnotized. I grabbed his arm. "Don't." He pulled free. The chamber we entered was low, cramped, glowing faintly. And the ceiling was etched. Dozens, hundreds of scratches carved overhead in neat rows. Not words I knew, not symbols I could map. Just the sense of a message beyond me. Clay stood under it, face slack. "I've been here before," he whispered. "You haven't," I said sharply, yanking at his pack strap. His eyes were glassy, his chest barely moving. I dragged him backward. He stumbled, gasped like surfacing, and blinked hard. We ran then. Not a measured retreat, just panic. The rock blurred. My hands bled from dragging against sharp corners. The markings began to vanish. The glow dimmed. Finally, miraculously, we spotted a chalk scrawl. One of mine. Faded but real. We followed, every nerve screaming. At last, the rope. We scrambled up, gasping as if drowning. The sky overhead was dusky purple. My watch read 4:17. Clay's phone said 9:02 the next morning. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. When I dropped him at his truck, he didn't even look at me. That night, I showered until the water ran cold, but the smell of dust clung. I finally collapsed into bed and woke around 3 to the faintest scraping sound outside my apartment door. Slow, deliberate. I pressed my ear to the wood. On the other side, something breathed in rhythm with me. When I checked the hallway at dawn, it was empty. But gouged into the plaster beside my doorframe were 4 fresh marks, parallel, too clean to be anything accidental. I landed a temporary contract with a regional survey outfit based in Virginia. They specialized in collecting data on karst terrain for infrastructure projects, roads, pipelines, that sort of thing. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was nothing to brag about. But the work gave me an excuse to wander the ridges and valleys instead of staring at spreadsheets in an office. For the better part of July, I was assigned to the Allegheny front with a coworker named Mason, an older guy who'd done cave exploration since before I was born. He could splice rope with one hand while eating jerky with the other, and he carried himself with that stubborn mountain pragmatism I both envied and distrusted. We had already flagged 3 depressions in the area. None remarkable, sinkholes filled with trash, shallow pockets barely deeper than a basement crawl. Mason had been making wisecracks about karst disappointment syndrome when he noticed something unusual behind the remains of a collapsed mission-style church. The chapel's roof was gone, beams rotting in a heap, but the rear wall still stood. Just beyond that wall, wedged between sandstone outcrops, a vertical slit sank into the ridge. "Not a collapse," Mason said, brushing moss away with his glove. "This is clean." A seam. He wasn't wrong. The fissure looked deliberate, as if the mountain had been cut open with a blade. The edges weren't rounded, no weathering, no talus debris. It ran straight down into shadow. The opening was just wide enough for a person to slide through sideways. No signs of previous visitors. No graffiti, no rope burns, not even a candy wrapper. That's rare in Appalachia. Even the most obscure hollows usually show some trace of hunters or kids with spray paint. We logged coordinates, snapped photos, and argued about a name before scribbling chapel seam in the notebook. Mason set anchors around the base of a twisted oak and dropped first. His radio crackled in my ear as he reported footing. Bone dry, no dripstone, that was odd enough. The caves in this region usually wept constantly, water staining everything orange with iron. I followed him down, gloves burning against the rope until my boots hit solid stone. The shaft opened into a small chamber no wider than a pickup truck. Smooth walls, pale, dry. It felt untouched. I pulled off my pack and checked the instruments. The barometer confirmed we weren't more than 60 meters down, but my ears felt like I'd descended twice that. Mason swept his light across the chamber and whistled low. "These walls don't look right," he was right again. Instead of bedding planes and jagged surfaces, the walls curved inward, smoothed into shapes like ribs. It was subtle, but it made my skin crawl. My first thought was that the void had formed outward instead of collapsing inward, as if something had pressed its way out. The crawl continued, narrow enough that our packs scraped the walls. At one point, I had to take mine off and push it ahead of me like a stubborn child. After 15 minutes, the crawl spilled into a chamber with a rounded ceiling maybe 3 meters high. We both froze at the same time. Our radios had gone silent. Just dead air. We weren't nearly deep enough for total signal loss. Mason frowned, tapped his mic. Got nothing. We carried on in tense silence until the passage brought us to a ledge that clung to the edge of a shaft. Mason dropped a rock and we waited for the telltale clink. Nothing. It was like tossing a pebble into the sky. That should have echoed, Mason muttered. His voice sounded small in that place. On the far side, the tunnel curled left. We edged across the ledge one at a time, backs pressed to the wall and ducked into the next corridor. That's when Mason stopped. You hear that? At first I didn't, then I caught it. A faint scraping behind us like stone dragged against stone. We swung our lamps back. The tunnel was empty. I marked the wall with a chalk arrow, more for my own nerves than necessity. We pressed on. The chamber we reached next was different. Perfectly centered as if measured, stood a square stone block waist high. Not a stalagmite, not a chunk that fell from the ceiling, stacked and shaped. On its surface was a shallow basin carved in a spiral pattern, grooves radiating outward with mathematical precision. Mason leaned close, tracing one with his glove. Carved from the center out, he said. Arm would have to twist backward to do it. I photographed it, but unease kept me from staring too long. The chamber had 3 exits. We chose the middle. I dropped a glow stick at the threshold. The tunnel sloped downward fast, steeper than it should have. My inclinometer read 15 degrees, but my body screamed 40. My boots skidded no matter how I leaned. Gravity's off, Mason muttered. I told him we should turn back. He nodded. We climbed the slope. At the top, the glow stick was gone. The tunnel behind us curved differently. Even our gear scrapes were missing. Mason pulled out his compass. The needle spun, stuttered, then locked west no matter how he turned. The passage we stumbled into next swallowed sound completely. I clapped. Nothing. Even my breath felt muffled like the air was drinking it. On the floor were 2 parallel drag marks, human length, carved into dust. They came from opposite corridors and stopped dead in the center. No footprints, just the trails, then the vibrations started. Not from beneath, but from the walls. A low thrum, steady, like the hum of distant machinery. We bolted into the right-hand passage without choosing. Every 20 or 30 meters, I noticed the same imperfections. A chip in the wall, a yellow mineral streak. They repeated exactly. After the 5th repetition, I stopped and counted the marks I'd made. There were more than I'd drawn. Mason turned to me suddenly. His face had gone pale. There's something on your hood. I reached back. Nothing but fabric. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking above. My lamp caught it, a hole opening in the ceiling. A circle, edges too smooth, no debris. A void where there hadn't been one. Mason staggered back. I saw a hand, he whispered. Bending wrong, we didn't discuss, we ran. The tunnel shrank until we were crawling, packs scraping, knees bleeding. Somewhere behind, I swore I heard my own voice whisper my name. At last, we saw light. Natural light filtering down through a shaft. Mason shouted, half relief, half terror. The rock pattern looked familiar, our original entry, but the rope wasn't ours. It was thicker, woven differently, frayed with age. Dusty, brittle, Mason yanked it. It held. He ordered me up first. I climbed, lungs tearing, heart punching against my ribs. The entire way I felt something rising behind me, matching each movement. Mason grabbed my arm and hauled me out. We collapsed in the weeds. The sun hung low and orange. My watch read 6:04. Mason's phone read the next morning. We didn't log the site, didn't record anything. We shoved gear into our packs and left. That night, back in my dorm at Eastmont, I woke to faint vibrations in the wall behind my bed. A hum buried in plaster. On the desk sat my inclinometer. It was spinning in slow circles, needle refusing to settle. And drawn into the wood, etched so faintly I hadn't noticed before, were 4 spirals. Perfect, symmetrical, coiling outward from the center. I was 29 the summer it all unraveled. At that point, I wasn't a student anymore. I'd burned out of school years earlier and drifted into temp jobs around Tucker County, patching together enough to pay rent and keep gas in my pickup. What kept me sane was hiking. Nothing hardcore, just long days alone with maps, boots, and the sound of my own breath. That's why it caught me off guard when Owen, a guy I hadn't spoken to since high school, suddenly reached out. Back then, Owen and I weren't close. He'd been the sort of kid who lurked in the library instead of the cafeteria, notebook full of half-sketched diagrams, talking in spirals until your head ached. We tolerated each other out of necessity. But now, more than a decade later, he sent me a message out of nowhere. "You ever seen Hollow Creek's split chamber? She's awake again. I thought it was a joke." Hollow Creek was a place name I vaguely remembered from childhood road trips, somewhere north of Canaan Valley, one of those half-vanished towns where coal companies had stripped the hills bare. Still, curiosity tugged at me. I asked what he meant. His reply was a blurry photo of a vertical drop, flashlight beam swallowed by blackness. Under it he typed, "The room. She hums when you stand still." I nearly blocked him right then. But a week later, when May, a grad student I'd been seeing casually, mentioned needing field data for her thesis on Appalachian karst features, I made the mistake of connecting the dots. I told her about Owen's message. She leaned forward, eyes lighting up. If it's real, if it's unmapped, that's publishable. So we drove. The directions Owen sent weren't directions at all, just GPS coordinates and a line that read, "No markers." The woods will know. We followed a logging road until the gravel ended in weeds, parked, and picked our way through brush. Owen's sedan was already there, door cracked as if he'd just stepped out. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel. From the outside, it was nothing. A fracture in the ridge, narrow and mean. I wouldn't have noticed it if not for Owen himself crouched by the roots, hands pressed reverently against the stone. He stood when we approached, thinner than I remembered, skin sallow, eyes jittering with sleepless light. He didn't bother with greetings. "This way," he said, and slid into the crack like he'd rehearsed it. May raised an eyebrow at me but followed. I went last, shoulders scraping. The air dropped cold immediately, smelling not of damp earth like most caves, but of metal, like coins left to rust. Inside, the tunnel bent twice before widening into a chamber barely tall enough to stand. The walls curved in like the inside of a bowl, surfaces etched with lines that shimmered faintly under our lamps. At first I thought they were tool marks, but they weren't regular. Spirals overlaid jagged grooves, branching shapes that mimicked veins. May knelt, running her fingers across one. Not glacial, not natural, too deliberate. Owen smiled thinly. She wrote them. May stood sharply. "Who?" He pointed toward a bulge in the far wall, where the stone jutted outward like half a fossil. Her face. I saw nothing but an irregular knob of limestone. I said, "All right, we've seen it. Let's log it and leave." But Owen wasn't moving. He pulled something from his pack, a figure maybe 6 inches long, carved crudely from bone or antler. Long arms, no eyes, a gaping oval mouth. He cradled it against his chest. "I made this," he whispered. She asked me to. She said May would understand. May stepped back. "I don't want it." "You already do," he said, voice flat. I moved between them. Owen's smile widened. Then he shoved me hard. My head cracked against stone and the chamber spun. By the time I staggered upright, May was struggling in his grip, the bone figure pressed against her chest. "She needs you," he hissed. May kicked him square in the shin, wrenching free. I lunged, tackled him. We slammed to the floor, my lamp rolling. He didn't even fight back properly, just writhed beneath me, laughing softly. Eyes fixed not on me, but on the ceiling. His flashlight died. Darkness swallowed everything. May yanked me up and we ran. The tunnels warped as we scrambled. Passages bending into angles I swore hadn't been there before. Surfaces smooth where I remembered jaggedness. My knees bled. My palms split. At one point I risked a glance behind. He was there, not chasing. Just standing, head tilted as if the cave itself had grown him from the stone. My chest seized. May pulled harder, and we burst through the laurel, collapsing in the clearing, air burning in our lungs. We drove back to town without speaking. When May filed a report with the Forest Service, rangers investigated. They confirmed a fissure near Hollow Creek, but said the tunnel collapsed 10 feet in. No chamber, no carvings, no side passages. Just rubble. Owen never resurfaced. His car was towed 2 weeks later. His name slid off campus forums and out of memory like he'd never existed. I wish it ended there. A month later, May stopped returning my messages. One evening, restless, I drove by her apartment. Her blinds were open. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. She was at her desk, notebook open, head bent. Not unusual. What froze me was her hand. She was dragging a pen across the wall beside her, not paper. Slow, deliberate spirals over and over, gouging lines until the plaster crumbled. Her face was blank, intent, like someone listening. When she finally turned toward the window, her eyes didn't look like May's at all. I left, and I haven't gone back. I wasn't the type to believe in maps scratched on the back of napkins or the stories of old hunters who couldn't tell the difference between truth and whiskey talk. But I'll admit, I was restless that fall. I just turned 35, divorced, burnt out from teaching middle school science in Charleston, and desperate to feel like I was doing something that wasn't slowly draining the marrow out of me. So when my friend Aaron from grad school called out of the blue, muttering about a lost survey route he'd picked up from a retired forester in Clay County, I let myself get hooked. He swore the line led through a stretch of the Gauley Range nobody used anymore, a piece of forest swallowed by time, fire, and bureaucratic oversight. He promised me it was more than just logging trails. They used to send men in there to mark boundaries, and not all of them came back, he said, his voice low like he was already telling me a ghost story. I laughed, but I said yes. The plan was simple. 2 days off the grid, a hike along this so-called forgotten line, camp if we found a clearing, and be back before Monday. I brought practical things: water filter, spare batteries, topo map of my own, a compass I'd trusted since college. Aaron, though, packed like a man heading for discovery. Climbing rope, carabiners, a drone he insisted could map tunnels, and even a bundle of glow sticks that rattled in his pack like candy. He looked giddy, 20 years younger, the way he used to get when a lab experiment was about to explode. We drove his beat-up Tacoma until the dirt road broke into weeds. The GPS blinked out 15 miles earlier, leaving only the compass needle trembling. I remember staring into that wall of trees, each trunk shaggy with moss and lichen, and feeling like the forest itself was holding its breath. Aaron spread out his yellowed photocopy on the hood of the truck, tracing the pencil line like a preacher pointing out scripture. "We follow the slope, then cut east when the ridge bends," he said. I didn't argue. My life was dull enough to welcome a little nonsense. The first few hours were easy. Thick undergrowth, slick stones, thorn scratches up and down our arms, but nothing unusual. Then the ground dipped, the air grew cooler, and we saw it. Not a sinkhole exactly, but a collapse in the earth where trees leaned inward as though peering into a secret. From above, it looked like an eye socket swallowed by vines. Aaron nearly danced down the slope, dropping the rope ladder before I could say anything. I muttered about liability, about cave safety, about all the warnings we'd ignored, but he was already descending, his laugh echoing up. Against better judgment, I clipped in and followed. The descent funneled us into a throat of stone. My shoulders scraped rock, dust sifted into my mouth, and then, suddenly, the passage opened. We stepped into a chamber so vast our headlamps looked like toy candles in a stadium. The air was dry, arid, no drip of water, no scatter of bats. It felt embalmed, sealed off from the living world. I caught myself whispering without realizing why, as though the cavern would punish me for speaking too loud. Aaron, ever the methodical one, cracked glow sticks and dropped them like breadcrumbs, chalking arrows every dozen steps. He muttered about untouched formations, untouched stone, how nothing here feels like a cave should. He wasn't wrong. The acoustics were strange. Our footsteps didn't echo. They sank muffled as if the rock itself absorbed sound. We followed one passage after another, most shallow and useless, until we came to an arch. Perfectly symmetrical, 10 feet tall, carved into the wall with precision no erosion could manage. The edges gleamed smooth as bone. Aaron touched it, tracing gouges that streaked the stone. Long, narrow scratches, like something had dragged itself through repeatedly. They weren't vertical like claw marks on a tree. They pulled forward, directional. My stomach turned cold. "It's been used," he whispered. Beyond the arch, the tunnels sloped downward in a spiral, too intentional to be nature's accident. As we descended, the air thickened. My pack felt heavier, and every breath rattled like dry paper. The ground gave a faint crunch, brittle, like stepping on old cicada husks. When I leaned close to the wall, I swore I saw thin silver veins running beneath the stone, pulsing faintly when I stared straight at them. Look away, and the shimmer stopped. Look back, and they throbbed like arteries. Then the radios quit. No static, no warning, just dead silence. Aaron slapped his headset, swapped batteries, cursed. "We keep going," he said firmly, though his hands trembled. The spiral dropped us into another chamber, and this one twisted my insides. The walls rose in ridges like ribs curving overhead, 12 of them exactly, enclosing us in a cage of stone. The floor was too clean. No dust, no debris, no trace of our glow sticks. The tunnel behind us was gone, replaced with a seamless wall of rock. I ran my palm over it, searching for chalk marks. Nothing. Not even powder. Aaron circled slowly, his face pale. "We didn't miss a turn," he whispered. That's when we heard it, 3 dull thuds. Flesh against stone. Not footsteps. Something heavier, deliberate. Then came the drag. A long scrape, slow, unhurried, as if whatever made it knew we couldn't leave. The sound crawled under my ribs. Aaron killed his headlamp with shaking fingers. In the dark, the chamber felt alive, pressing close. Another knock, closer. Another drag, louder. I don't remember deciding to run, but suddenly we were sprinting blind, flares hissing in our hands. We barreled through a sloping passage that yawned downward like a throat. My knees screamed, but I didn't stop. At some point, I realized Aaron's light was gone. I turned, shouting his name, but only my own panic came back. Then I saw it, his flare on the ground, still burning. Beside it, a smooth streak in the dust, as if his whole body had been pulled away in one clean motion. His pack, his harness, his boots, all gone with him. I froze, bile rising, then forced my legs forward. I don't know how long I ran. Time bent in on itself. I saw the same corners repeat, only this time marked with chalk symbols I hadn't drawn. Circles, spirals, jagged lines etched deeper than chalk could cut, glowing faintly like embers. I stumbled into the ribcage chamber again, but now the ceiling was gone. Above stretched a vertical shaft that swallowed my flare's light. And there was something up there. Something watching, though I couldn't see it, only feel the weight of its gaze pressing down. Then I noticed a second arch across the chamber, larger, glowing faintly blue. Not like stone, but like light shaped into form. I didn't question. I hurled myself through it. Blinding daylight seared my eyes. I collapsed on a grassy slope, gasping, my hands trembling. When my vision cleared, I realized I wasn't anywhere near the sinkhole we'd entered. I was east, miles away on the far side of the ridge. Behind me there was no opening, no sign of stone or cavern, just wind in the trees. When I staggered back to the truck hours later, Aaron's gear was in the bed, neatly stacked. Boots clean, drone untouched, chalk packed away. Only the rope ladder was missing. I told the story once to a ranger I half trusted. He listened, stone-faced, then shook his head. "You wandered into the hollow veins," he said. "You're lucky you came back." I asked what that meant. He said old miners used to speak of shafts that weren't carved by men. Veins that pulsed with something older, where sound died and men vanished. Some swore the ridges themselves were alive, feeding on those who dug too deep. Most laughed it off as superstition. But he didn't laugh. I never saw Aaron again. Every so often I dream of him standing in the ribcage chamber, staring up at that black shaft. Sometimes he calls my name. Sometimes he doesn't have a mouth. I was 27 when my older sister's friend Caleb called me about a celebration he had in mind. He just finished a graduate program in cartography, and instead of drinking himself stupid or booking some loud trip to Myrtle Beach, he wanted to honor the occasion in what he called his own language. For him, that meant maps, terrain, the places between dots that no one bothered marking. He told me about an old boundary survey he'd stumbled across in the county records of Randolph, West Virginia. One page of the microfilm was warped, and along the margin, someone had penciled in coordinates that didn't match any known trail. Next to the numbers was a phrase written in shaky hand. "Do not linger. Exit fast." I thought it was a prank some clerk scribbled decades ago, but Caleb swore the location corresponded to a forgotten section of the Cheat Mountain backcountry, a place left off most modern ranger maps. He framed it as an adventure. 2 days of hiking, some camping, and maybe, if we were lucky, the discovery of a collapsed mine or old surveyor's shelter. I just quit my job at a call center in Pittsburgh and had nothing better to do, so I said yes. We left early on a gray October morning. I stuffed my pack with the basics: food bars, water filter, an extra thermal blanket, and a battered headlamp I used on night runs. Caleb, ever the romantic, brought rope, chalk, and a handheld radio. He insisted might still pick up emergency frequencies down there. He also strapped a cheap GoPro knockoff to his chest. "If we find anything, it should be documented," he said, his grin wide but nervous. The drive was long and empty. We turned off the paved road onto gravel, then off gravel onto something that hardly qualified as a road at all. Fallen branches littered the way, and weeds scraped the underside of the truck. The GPS cut out an hour before we parked at a forgotten firebreak. No trail markers, no human noise. Only the distant croak of ravens and the hollow rush of wind funneling through trees. The hike in was rougher than I expected. We followed a faint deer path through brush, weaving around blown-down pines and stands of laurel. Every so often we passed rusted remnants of deer stands rotting in the canopy. Their ladders collapsed, swallowed by vines. Caleb marched with purpose, consulting his photocopied notes, mumbling about elevation changes and slope gradients. I mostly kept my head down, pushing through undergrowth and thinking about how empty this stretch of land felt. Not remote like wilderness, but neglected, like even nature wanted little to do with it. 3 miles in, Caleb stopped abruptly. He pointed to a ridge scarred by loose shale. Beneath an overhang of cracked stone, half hidden by ivy, yawned an opening no taller than my shoulders. The mouth looked like it had been pinched closed by the earth itself, barely wide enough to squeeze through. No air flowed from it, no scent of moisture or moss, just silence, dead, absolute. "This is it," he said almost reverently. Before I could answer, he crouched and slipped inside. I hesitated. Every nerve told me to stay in the daylight, but curiosity pulled harder. I followed, the world collapsing into stone around me. The entry sloped downward fast, funneling us 15 feet into a ledge. Our lights revealed smooth, pale walls that curved like river stone. Except it was bone dry. No dampness, no mineral smell, not even dust. Like the place had been sealed in a jar. "Not a mine," Caleb murmured. "No pick marks, no beams. Too organic." We pressed on, chalking arrows on the stone every dozen steps. About 100 meters in, the tunnel forked. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, then chose the left passage. Later he admitted he felt a faint warmth in that direction, though the air on my skin stayed cold. The cave played tricks immediately. Some stretches echoed sharply, every step rebounding until it sounded like a crowd followed us. Then without warning, the acoustics smothered themselves. Our voices came out dull and flat as if spoken into pillows. My own breath sounded wrong, loud one moment, silent the next. An hour later, the walls darkened from gray to matte black. Our lights barely penetrated it. The beam swallowed after only a few feet. Along the walls were strange grooves, long curves that twisted at unnatural angles. Some curled upward, others sideways, as though gravity meant nothing when they were carved. Caleb touched one, pulled back quickly. "Feels burned," he muttered. Like stone after lightning. We entered a cavern so wide our lamps dissolved into nothing. The ceiling vanished above, unseen. The floor sloped toward a pit that consumed light entirely. Caleb tossed a pebble. No echo, no clatter, just absence. We sat at the edge, ate jerky in silence, too aware of how wrong it all felt. That's when it came. The sound. A single whistle, sharp and deliberate, like someone summoning a dog. It didn't echo. It didn't repeat. It simply existed, then vanished. "You heard that," Caleb whispered. I nodded, throat dry. "Yeah, it wasn't natural. We should have turned back then." We tried, but the passage we'd taken was gone. Our chalk marks erased. The walls pressed in, smooth, untouched, as though we'd never set foot there. We picked a direction and walked, and walked. The tunnels twisted but never led us back. At one corner, I spotted old graffiti scrawled into the stone. MR 1968. We sighed with relief, sign of other explorers. But 10 minutes later, the same inscription appeared again. This time, deeper in, etched fresher, like it had just been carved. Then again, further still. 3 identical tags in 3 different places. Caleb laughed weakly. Either someone was really bored or... He didn't finish. The air pressed harder, not with scent but with weight, like the cave itself was inhaling. The walls trembled, faint but noticeable. Then we heard it. A slow metallic clicking, steady as a pendulum. Not echo, not dripping water. Controlled, calculated. Caleb keyed the radio. Static. He tried again. Nothing. We stumbled into rooms that weren't natural at all. Angular corners, sharp ceilings barely taller than us. Dead ends sealed with smooth plains of rock. The space shifted from geology into architecture, as though the cave had been designed. In one alcove, we found 3 sleeping bags arranged neatly in a triangle. Beside them sat ancient packs, moldy paperbacks, rusted utensils, a flashlight long corroded. No IDs, no names. Caleb opened a bag. It was pristine inside, untouched. No creases where a body had ever lain. A knife was jammed deep into the stone, its hilt quivering as if it had just been placed there. On the wall, gouged in deep letters, "Leave now." We didn't argue. We fled, but the cave didn't let us. Passages collapsed behind us. Others stretched into tight funnels that forced us to crawl. The clicking... I was 34 when my old climbing partner Mason started pestering me about a forgotten system he swore was real. Mason had this streak. Once something lodged in his head, he couldn't let it go until he either proved it wrong or dragged someone else down with him. I hadn't been caving in years, not since a bad fall cracked my helmet and nearly my skull. But he wore me down with promises of an easy trip, a quick in and out, nothing technical. He said this wasn't on maps, wasn't even whispered about in ranger stations. A gift, he called it, like he'd been handed a treasure. The story was that someone stumbled across it in the late 70s while surveying timber cuts. But whatever they found didn't get documented, just whispered along between loggers and ex-military types, until it landed in Mason's lap. He repeated the same word every time, untouched. Pristine chambers that haven't seen a single footprint, he'd say, like it was scripture. I didn't believe half of it, but I also wasn't doing much with my weekends anymore. Since my divorce, the apartment felt like a box closing in. Hiking into the Allegheny backcountry with Mason and a couple of his new friends sounded better than drinking myself into another Sunday hangover. We left early on a Friday. 4 of us jammed into Mason's Tacoma. Mason, me, his buddy Ren, and a younger guy named Cole, who still had the stiffness of military training in the way he checked and rechecked his pack. Ren worked summers guiding canoe trips and looked like he'd been born under a tree canopy. I mostly came along because Mason asked, because some part of me still wanted to feel like I could do these things. The directions were a photocopy of a photocopy. Jagged lines, crooked arrows, and Mason's scribbles about ridgeline here and look for stone cut. No coordinates we could plug into anything, no official trailhead. We drove until pavement dissolved into gravel, then gravel into dirt, and finally into a stretch of brush barely recognizable as a road. We parked on what Mason claimed had once been a service lane for fire crews. From there it was on foot, pushing through overgrowth, ducking under fallen branches, clambering over ridges of shale. After nearly an hour of bushwhacking, Mason stopped suddenly, eyes lit up like a preacher at the pulpit. He brushed aside a curtain of roots and moss from a bluff, and there it was, a fissure in the rock, no wider than a coffin lid. It was easy to miss, just a crack in limestone shadowed by vines. If we hadn't been searching, we would have walked right past. We geared up. Helmets, gloves, lights, chalk, spare batteries, radios. Cole insisted on checking air quality with a small handheld monitor. It beeped clean. One by one we slid inside. Mason first, then Ren, then Cole. I hesitated before bringing up the rear, staring at the way the vines fell back into place as if sealing us in. The first 20 yards were crawl space hell. Flat on our stomachs, pushing forward with toes, stone scraping ribs and elbows. My chest clenched with that old panic, but finally the passage widened enough for us to crouch. We switched off to a steady pace, chalking arrows on walls and dropping glow sticks every so often. That's when the silence hit me. Caves usually hum in their own way, drips from stalactites, whisper of airflow, the shifting groan of rock. This place had nothing. It wasn't just quiet. It was like sound itself refused to exist. When I stopped moving, I realized I couldn't even hear my own breath right. The absence dug under my skin. We pressed deeper for hours. The walls shifted strangely, from natural roughness to long stretches of uniform smoothness, like corridors shaped by intention. Ren joked that we were walking into some Cold War bunker, but his laugh fell flat in the stale air. Eventually, we found a pocket chamber slick with condensation. No stream, no trickle, no obvious source of moisture. Just a thin, wet sheen clinging to the walls as though the rock was sweating. Above a low stone shelf, a fissure split upward. Mason lit up instantly, scrambling to wedge himself inside before anyone could stop him. We followed, grunting and twisting as we shimmied up the narrow shaft. My shoulders locked once, forcing me to backtrack half a foot just to shift my angle. That's when I heard it. A scrape behind me, quick and deliberate. I froze. "Cole, was that you?" Silence. He was still below me, grunting his way upward. No one had shifted near enough to make that sound. The shaft spit us into a dome-shaped chamber at least 50 feet across. Our headlamp skimmed the ceiling but couldn't pin it down. The acoustics were worse here. Each footstep cracked too sharply, then disappeared as if swallowed. My balance wavered just listening to it. Then Cole swept his light across the far wall. There was a hole. A perfect circle, maybe 3 feet across, carved clean into stone. Not rounded by erosion, not jagged like collapse. Precise, as if drilled by a machine. Smooth edges, no dust, no rubble. Just an invitation of pitch darkness. "This isn't natural," Ren muttered. Mason grinned like a kid and dove through without hesitation. Cole followed. Ren sighed and went after. I was last again, dread clawing my throat. The tunnel bent, sloped downward, then snapped into a sharp turn. I reached out to steady myself and stopped. The walls weren't rock anymore. They were too smooth, too deliberate. Under my gloves, I felt grooves, etched patterns, not repeating, not random, but organized. They pulsed faintly beneath my touch like veins under skin. The passage spilled into a chamber so wrong I nearly forgot to breathe. It was square, perfectly square, a room the size of a warehouse, every wall seamless, covered with incised geometry. Lines, spirals, grids that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. Not language, not art. Just patterns with no human sense. Mason was crouched at the center, waving us over. "Look," he hissed. The beam of his lamp fell across the floor. Footprints, not ours. Long, thin, six-toed, pressed sharp into the dustless floor. Dozens of them. Each one perfect, leading nowhere. They began in the middle and ended in the middle, like whatever left them had appeared and vanished without crossing a threshold. Ren swore under his breath. Cole's jaw flexed, hands tight on his pack straps. Then Ren turned to go back. He stopped cold. The tunnel we'd entered was gone. In its place was smooth, blank wall. Cole dropped his bag, pulled out a climbing pick, and slammed it against the wall. The clang rang out metallic hollow, and left not so much as a scratch. That's when our lamps began to flicker. Mason smacked his headlamp, swore. Ren's blinked once, then steadied. Cole's died outright. I slapped mine, heart hammering until it sputtered back alive in a weak, dim glow. I was 32 when my childhood friend Logan convinced me to go underground again. I'd sworn off serious caving years earlier after watching a man break his leg in a shaft outside Harlan. But Logan had this way of dragging people into his obsessions. He'd been chasing the same rumor since college. A nameless cavern system somewhere off Crooked Run, deep in the Monongahela, that didn't appear on maps. He called it a gap the surveyors forgot. I wasn't excited about it. My life had already shifted to desk hours, groceries on Sundays, and the kind of safe routines you build after marriage falls apart. But he caught me at a weak point in December, when the office shut down for the holidays, and I had no plans. He pitched it like a weekend diversion. A short hike, a little belly crawl, maybe a couple of chambers. Nothing serious. We'll be home before anyone misses us. We weren't going alone. Logan brought his niece Mara, 17, sharp as broken glass, already enrolled in community college. She'd been making short films and insisted on bringing a chest-mounted camera rig to document the find. She moved with the impatient confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt herself. Logan carried the printed maps and the color-coded notes, each corner highlighted like a military op plan. I brought redundancy: sat phone, trauma kit, backup lights, extra water. We joked that if Logan was the visionary, I was the insurance policy. We left before dawn, the truck packed to bursting with gear. The road dwindled from pavement to gravel, from gravel to ruts, until finally we parked on a forgotten forestry lane. The hike in was cold and sharp, frost crunching under boots, the air heavy with the smell of pine sap. Mara filmed everything, narrating half-serious commentary about how this will either be a discovery or a Darwin Award. The hillside was unremarkable, until Logan brushed aside a tangle of briars and ivy. There it was, a split in the limestone, narrow and jagged, as though the earth itself had cracked a grin. No marker, no trail sign, nothing to suggest it had ever been cataloged. If you weren't looking, you'd pass it without a thought. We geared up and belly crawled the entrance, packs shoved ahead. The rocks scraped our sides, the kind of crawl that forces you to question whether curiosity is worth claustrophobia. After 20 feet, the passage opened just enough for us to crouch. My breath fogged in the beam of my headlamp, but the air didn't move. That was the first wrongness I noticed. Caves always breathe a little, pulling and pushing drafts. This one was sealed, stagnant. We marked our path with bright tape and chalk arrows. The walls rose in strange shelves, slick in places, bone dry in others. More than once I stumbled, convinced I felt the floor dip, though it looked flat. Mara was unbothered. She ducked into a side tunnel and came out with her gloves covered in tiny bones. "Rabbits or possums," she said, filming them with eerie enthusiasm. The bones were so clean they gleamed in her light, as though they'd been bleached by invisible hands. By late afternoon, we reached what Logan's notes called the vault. It lived up to the name. The passage spat us into a massive chamber, 30 feet wide and far taller. Stone columns rose like petrified trees, frozen mid-reach. Our lamps barely skimmed the ceiling. The air dropped 10 degrees colder than the tunnels. Our sweat froze against our layers, yet the stone beneath our boots felt oddly warm, as if heat pulsed from beneath. We camped along the far wall. Dinner was dehydrated pasta kits Logan swore were safe, though Mara wrinkled her nose and muttered that they tasted like pennies boiled in mop water. We forced the food down, played a few half-hearted rounds of cards, then zipped into our bags early, knowing we'd tackle the steepest drop in the morning. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke gagging. My gut wrenched as if it wanted to turn itself inside out. I barely unzipped the bag before vomiting across stone. Every muscle trembled with cramps. Across the chamber, Logan hunched near the gear pile, retching so hard his back arched like a bow. Mara coughed violently inside her tent, a wet, choking sound that turned my blood cold. It didn't feel like food poisoning. It felt orchestrated, like the cave itself was rejecting us. I staggered toward Mara's voice. She wasn't in her tent anymore. The flap hung open, her footprints trailing into the wrong passage, the one we'd marked unstable. I shouted, but Logan only slumped against the wall, whispering through cracked lips. "The air's wrong. It's breathing." I clipped my last good lamp to my chest, grabbed a rope, and stumbled into the flagged tunnel. It funneled narrow, slick with condensation. 15 feet in, the floor dropped. I slid, skin tearing on stone, and landed beside Mara. She lay curled, eyes wide but unseeing, chest heaving shallow. Her flashlight rolled beside her, dim and dying. When I touched her shoulder, her skin was clammy as river ice. She didn't speak, didn't even blink. Dragging her back was hell. I had to wedge her feet forward inch by inch, scraping my arms bloody against the walls. My breath roared in my ears until I realized the sound wasn't mine alone. Something else was exhaling in the dark, long, slow breaths that rose from behind the stone. The cave wasn't silent anymore. It was whispering. By the time I pulled Mara into the vault, Logan had collapsed completely. His lips were gray, his eyes glassy. He kept murmuring about figures behind the columns. Don't let them touch her. over and over until the words slurred into nonsense. I tore open the sat phone. The signal stuttered but caught. The voice on the other end was calm, almost rehearsed. I explained everything: sickness, Mara unresponsive, air heavy. The operator said help was coming, then added, "Stay inside. Do not attempt to exit. Wait it out." Her emphasis chilled me more than the stone. Those hours before rescue blurred. The whispers grew louder, circling the chamber. Not echoes, they didn't repeat. They prowled. Sometimes I caught fragments. My own name, Logan's groans twisted back at us. Mara's shallow breaths turned into mocking laughter. I clutched the flashlight until my hands cramped, whispering nonsense to myself just to hold on. When the rescue team finally arrived, it felt unreal. Bright lights, masks, stretchers. Mara went out first, limp but breathing. Logan needed 2 men to lift him. One rescuer looked at me and asked if I could walk. I said yes, tried to stand, and collapsed. They half-dragged me out. Daylight burned like salvation. Mara spent 3 weeks in the hospital. Official cause: severe bacterial contamination from improperly sterilized rations. The company recalled entire batches. 2 other hikers in different states died from the same meals. Logan recovered but never spoke of caves again. He boxed his gear, shoved it into the attic, and took up gardening like a man desperate to stay above ground. Mara smashed her camera